Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jakub Isański from the University of Adam Mickiewicz in Poznań, who is going to talk about the strategies of survival of civilians in the Polish lands between 1939 and 1956. His team made a formidable work of investigating memoirs of Poles who lived in that era, and the discoveries from the memoirs and the witnesses of Poles, the witnesses of those terrible times, are truly impressive. So I welcome Professor Isański with a solid piece of good historical work.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, after such a nice introduction, I would like to start with the table of contents of my work. I will start with the pictures. You can see these are the contemporary present-day pictures from one open-air museum in eastern Poland, but it reminds me the past world, the past that has been destroyed by the war and all the Stalinist efforts after it. The title of my presentation limits the scope of my interest from 1939 up to 1956. As for the civilians or for locals, so to speak, the Victory Day was not so impressive or noticeable at all because the violence, cruelty, and all acts of, how to say that, I will show in a moment. So this is my abstract. You can see on the posters from this conference. And the last sentence is the vast majority of these materials have not been published so far. I mean that there is a body of more than 1,000 of diaries collected by the Institute of Western Affairs in Poznań, Poland. And the first competition was announced in 1956, and this was a very special period of time in Polish history. And again, as I'm a sociologist, I analyze these facts from the sociological perspective. And it was so special because after Stalin's death and the end of Stalinism, people in Poland as well as in other Central European countries, say Hungarians, believe that this is the end of communism and this is the time for freedom. For the first time for 15 years since the beginning of the World War II, you can tell the truth, you can describe all the things you had to face during the war and during the liberation and after the war. Some other pictures for me as a sociologist. It contains some interesting information. I guess you might know the left one. It is the monument in Warsaw Uprising, and one of the youngest partisans involved in fights, in struggles. It's just a monument from Warsaw. The middle one is for Polish Catholic priests, which is Maximilian Maria Kolbe, who died in Auschwitz, sacrificing his life for another fellow prisoner. And the right one seems to be the most interesting. It is in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in woodlands in southeastern Poland, and it's just one of many, I think one of hundreds of very small monuments located in nowhere, in places where people during the war died, when they were executed, when they just had to die. What about the competitions? What about the diaries? As I told, there are more than 1,000 of them. There were 3 competitions announced, and the first one is the most interesting. The Institute of Western Affairs in Poznań collected more than 200 of memories, and they are very diverse. Some of them are extremely short, say 1 page long, written by illiterate people with very poor literacy in Polish. as Professor Hodakiewicz say, for instance, if they are Belarusians, they are locals, so the language they used were just local, with a variety of dialect words and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, the idea of this competition was a part of continuation of a so-called biographical method in sociology founded by Polish sociologist Florian Staniecki with the American fellow sociologist William Thomas from Chicago University of Illinois at Chicago. And it, well, that's it. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is just to introduce the area of the context of migrations during the war and post-war period. Oh, that's better. So as you can see, there is an eastern part of Poland that was captured by Soviets after the World War II, and the northern and western part of Poland that we captured from Germany. In 1945, there was kind of an extreme in numbers movement of people, forced migrations of about 15 millions of people. Generally speaking, from the east to the west. The red figures symbolize Poles, the blue one symbolizes Germans, the green one is for Belarusians, and the yellow ones are for Ukrainians. About 1/3 of citizens of Poland has changed their place of residence, and as I told, it was kind of a huge movement, forced ones with extreme conditions. And I would like to present you selected examples from these memories, about 25 examples of memories illustrating the war, the liberation, and the migration just after the war. What about authors of diaries? Two-thirds of them were men. More than 80% of authors were married, and it's, for me as a sociologist, it's a kind of an interesting issue, because you can imagine the post-war time, the most difficult experience in Polish history ever, I mean the World War II. And even though 80%, more than 80% of our authors were married, while today it is somehow similar. So we have the period of prosperity, we have the economic growth, and about 1/5 of Poles are not married and are single. So they see that the situation, according to sociological researchers, the situation is too difficult to be married or to be in a relationship with anybody. Okay, what about education? As you can see, we don't have data in percentage because, well, the war was kind of a disaster for any educated people in Europe, in Poland particularly. Both parts, say Germans and Soviets, introduced organized actions against educated people. They were executed in many ways. So, generally speaking, even for more than 1,000 diaries, for more than 1,000 authors, only 80 of them had higher education, and we have lack of information about others, in fact. What about social backgrounds? You can see peasants or farmers, about 40% of them, similar percentage for workers, say manual workers, and only 1/5 of them had, in fact, any education, and I mean they had formal education to be clerks or had, so to speak, professional education to be artisans. And this is also another information which is somehow funny today, but 50 years ago it was also collected. What about the ideological provenience of authors? And as you can see, half of them were not party members. Today it is, as I see it, very interesting and important information, because in 1950s in Poland, if you were not a party member, you had no opportunity for a career. You, in fact, were somehow threatened in expulsion from work, so you had to be fired with no results just because you were not a member of a party.
Communist Party, right?
Communist Party, and there are some other parties too. So such a percentage of non-party members mean that about half of our respondents, half of authors of these diaries, were brave enough to write first that they are not party members, and second, send their own memories, their own diaries for such a competition. Again, 1956, and the time that people believe that communism is over, the freedom has started. What about, and this is the last slide for our respondents. It presents information about the type of place of origin versus place of settlement. For instance, the first column for rural areas symbolizes, it means that about 80% of people who were forced to live in rural areas came from rural areas. But as you can see, for people who live in big cities, again, it is not a statistical data. This is just the information of authors from our competition. So even people living in big cities, you can see there were many people from rural areas somehow forced to live in big cities. In fact, there were just two big cities in Western Poland, Szczecin and Wrocław. And those who stayed in pre-war Polish territory were Lwów and Wilno, so there were not too many big cities. What's about towns, there were also some people in terms of their social background, in terms of their professional background, who were forced to change their place of residence, were forced to change their entire lives, not only by moving from one place to another, but also in having a necessity to learn something new, to start a new life. So now I would like to present three, chapters of my speech. The first is for victims. As I told, there were more than 1,000 of memories, and finally we qualified 709 of them as interesting. And for this body of materials, in 193, there were descriptions of being a victim of a variety of crime acts during the war. The war, I mean military actions, and civilians as, witnesses on one hand, but victims on the other had to face the situation. On the occupation means the period of the war with no official military actions, and the liberation means the period that started in 1945 or 1944, in fact, in Eastern Poland, and lasted, say, until 1956. And it was not liberation, of course, but it was the time of mass looting, mass violence, mass cruelty against civilians. And I would like to present particular examples in such a way. The materials are coded according to the number sent for the competition, and it is sex, it means it's written by a man, and he was about 30 years old at the time of writing this report, and I hope it is visible from the very last row. Well, first, it is a short part of a memory from Bydgoszcz, the city in central Poland that has a German minority, and in September 1939, as soon as the war started, Germans in Bydgoszcz started to attack Polish troops. And as soon as Bydgoszcz was captured by German army, all the Poles in Bydgoszcz were, how to say that, threatened with lots of discrimination is the light word. You can see there is a description of executions against Poles, of mass executions with, as usually during the war, with no reason. The execution on young boys, the execution on a man with her child, the execution of a priest who was there too. There is another example and similar way of coding data. So it was memory written by a man at the age of more or less 50 years old. And sometimes we are able to identify the exact age of writer. Sometimes it was more complicated. In this particular example, it is a description of, so to speak, a death march for arrested soldiers and civilians, as well as Jews. And no matter about the ethnic background, but all of them were just shot to death during the march by German watchmen, guards, whatever. Another example, written report by a 40-year-old woman. It was not a victim of these acts, but it was a mother, a nobleman member. It was a princess, by the way, and her son was the commander of the unit. Fortunately, he managed to survive the war, and he managed to survive only because his fellow soldiers from his unit talked to Bolsheviks, to Soviet army, that he is not an officer at all, but his hands, the hands like this. You can see Soviets during the World War had a very clear way to identify who is an officer and who is educated. If you had gentle hands, it means that you are a gentleman. If you used to work manually or used to work as a farmer, it was identifiable. But his colleagues from his unit managed to save his hand, as they told that he is a writer in this unit, so that's why his hands looks like that. Another example of young woman. It is about 50 years old, but we believe that she was younger because she writes that she used to be a forced worker in Germany, Central Germany, and she was forced to live in such a horrible conditions that she decided to got pregnant to save her life, because at that time being pregnant, if you were pregnant, I mean women, you were just sent back home from Germany, but even though it was not saved her, unfortunately. Another example for German strategy to involve Poles in occupation practices, there were many acts of Germans were trying to force Poles to, in this particular example, to watch the railway tracks at night. And peasants were forced to watch it because partisans were trying to blow up trains in this particular place. So on one hand, if they noticed it and didn't inform Germans, they were sentenced to death or sent to concentration camp. But if they, that's just a tragedy of locals at the time. Another example was the Germans in that area. It was in northeastern Poland, northeastern occupying Poland, that all the cats in the village were counted because the partisans were how to say that, partisans needed cats because Germans were trying to find them with dogs. So if partisan units had a cat, and if they noticed that there is a dog, all they had to do is just to release a cat, and the police dogs were trying to catch a cat, and partisans had a chance to escape from Germans. There was another example of report with the price for a Pole, as another man, about 55 years old, claimed he was sold for 16 Reichsmarks during the war. By the way, it was a very low price because German machine gun MG42 costed about 1,200 Reichsmarks. So the price for a human being at that time was 16 Reichsmarks. In this example, as he claimed he was too old, and the director of his, how to say that, manor house was not satisfied, he chose another one, but he was not satisfied with another one, so sent him to Auschwitz for death. Another example, and the price is even lower because there were also children sold in here, 12-year-old boys and 14 years old girls, sold for 10 Reichsmarks during the, how to say that, the ceremony of buying new workers.
Was Reichsmark a unit? That was a unit of currency.
Reichsmarks. It is just a Reichsmark, the currency during the war. Yes,
Okay. About 50 cents. Okay.
I guess so. And there were also some examples of sabotage during the war. This one was described by a forced worker. In winter time, it was quite easy to destroy any machine just if you pour hot water or water inside any engine or any mechanical part of the machine. It was easily destroyable. So this was about victims and the descriptions of crime acts. While here are some other examples of being a witness of crime acts during the wartime, as well as during the liberations. The liberation, as you can see, there is a variety of I would say, crime acts. And the pity is that these diaries are well known, are widely available, but very little is known about the content of these diaries because, well, honestly speaking, I'm not sure why, but perhaps it should be better known. And there is another well-known picture of drunken Soviet soldiers trying to rape women in Germany, but I will show you some examples. There's another example of crime acts, definitely, that, and many authors of memories provide such information that they were forced to participate in public executions. In some cases, it was regularly, say once a week. There's such an example from Białowieża in eastern Poland, in fact, where children were forced to participate once a week, every Friday or Saturday, to watch when partisans were hanged. And in here, even parents of partisans were forced to not only to watch, but also to, as written, put loops around the heads of their sons. There is another example from Volhynia, the southeastern part of Poland. It is one of the extreme ones, although very short in description. It presents the death of 3 Catholic priests killed by Ukrainians during that days, written by a woman, 57 years old. Another example of another common practice against Poles in occupied country, it was burning them in any wooden building in countryside. As you noticed in the first slide, the picture of open-air museum. And wooden buildings. So during the war, there were many examples of such an activity when people with the entire families, usually women or children, because men were just partisans at that times, usually, so as a kind of mass responsibility, locals in a village that were claimed to support partisans were killed and burned in any building. Another one, similarly shocking as I see it, from Krakow, the former medieval capital city of Poland, and an Austrian butcher who was caught by locals, by his neighbors, for killing a young lady, young girl. And when they entered the house, because it was so shocking that they called the German police to check the situation, so he, as you can see, he confessed that he had murdered about 70 girls that way, and he produces food, sausages, to sell it in Vienna just to, according to his words, just to multiply food resources, because Poles, Jews, and Gypsies were intended to be subhumans, just to exterminate. Another example for the liberation time and the cruelty and the misery of civilians during that time, perhaps I should tell about it at the very beginning of my speech, that for the Polish lands during the war, about for one single killed soldier, there were 90% of all the victims during the wartime were just civilians. So another relation this time from Lwów, the eastern Poland, the big city, and the deportation, terror, arrests, and so on and so forth, done by Red Army officers as well as NKVD. They arrested and deported to Siberia all the academics, professors from Polytechnic, as well as the youth from the university. Another example of very short relations written by a young woman with her small child. She had to, according to her words, he had to spend 2 weeks with dead corpse in a basement because it was too dangerous to go outside. And when they were out of any food for 3 days and she decided to go out, her husband was immediately caught by German soldiers, and as you can read, she had no news about her husband, which means, of course, that she was shot to death. Another example of, I think, the well-known fact of mass rapes that happened during the liberation by Soviet soldiers. And this is somehow shocking, not only because of the description of the act of raping women, but because, first of all, there are dozens of such descriptions, and for the people who had to live there, who were just under first occupation, then liberation, and then Soviet domination, it was just like there was no chance to escape it, because even though you saw it, even though you were a victim of such an act, you had no opportunity to report it to anybody, to report it to police. If it was conducted by Russian soldiers, it was even better not to tell it to anybody, because you could be shot for informing about that. And what was so much shocking, it's not only the number of such acts, but also that it was just like, how to say that everybody could have been raped, including women, children, men, and animals as well. And there are some descriptions of zoophilia, so it is even more shocking. Another description of mass rape of German women, because in such a case they had just no chances to escape, and it was even worse for them to survive such a liberation. Well, that's it. Another illustration of these acts. What was also, let's say, threatening, that many of the victims died just after the acts of rape because of the weather conditions. It was during the winter time, because of the lack of any medical help, and because of the acts of rape were usually extremely cruel. This is another example of memoirs. You can see the majority of all of the relations were somehow out of censorship. And this particular example with the crossed letters is just an attempt of a writer not to inform us, say academics, who ordered his or her, it was written by a woman, that the one who did it, I mean who attacked them, who stole the goods, were a Russian sailor. So the author at that time believed that just by doing this thing, crossing these suspicious letters, will provide him safety. And again, extremely shocking, as I see it, example of description of rape. As you can see, the last sentence. She went to buy cows. She came back without cows, without money, and as a woman, she has lost something more. Another example of prisoners from Ravensbrück concentration camps who were saved by American soldiers. But this is an interesting example of, as described, guards, the old ones, and soldiers, German soldiers, who refused to murder former prisoners of the concentration camp during the march, because, as written, they noticed that it was a lie, that they were murderers and bandits. It doesn't matter if they decided to save their own lives in that way, but fortunately all of the prisoners managed to survive. As written by a man, 55 years old, he weighed less than 50 kilos during the liberation. He lost over 30 kilos in weight during the concentration camp. And the last chapter of my speech, it is mainly focused on the liberation and migration. Migration as an act of movement in space from one place to another. As I told, the movement that started in 1944 and lasted as a mass activity, mass in numbers up to 1956. We noticed an example of traumatic experience in about, not in exact, 220 relations. At first it was so difficult because of the weather conditions. No matter if it was a winter time or if it was raining, the infrastructure at that time was extremely, how to say that, destroyed is the light word again. For all the carriages they had to travel were somehow low quality, at least. Okay, let me show you the examples. Oh, another for the, how to describe it. It is one of the Polish heroes of the Second World War, the one who was the commander of the defending the army officer from the Oksywia. He was murdered in 1952 by communists. The pre-war officer, he used to be a prisoner of Oflag, so the camp for officers during the war. He decided to come back to Poland just after the war. He was imprisoned, and at the very end of Stalinist era, he was murdered by Polish communist court. I was invited just 2 years ago for the funeral ceremony because just 2 years ago his remains were found. So whatever you think about the liberation, and at times it was, I will show you examples. Another one written by a woman whose husband has came back from the West and he was greeted with such words by local clerks. "We hate you, you bastards. Why you came here? The Western army does not matter at all." So all the people who were trying to come back to Poland just after the war were threatened in such a way of treatment as I presented in a map. About 500,000 of former soldiers, former prisoners and forced workers decided not to come back to Poland as they were afraid of their own safety. Another short part of memoirs written by a man, and I underlined these names: Siberia, Kazakhstan, Vorkuta, Kauga, because he was a railman and he worked as how to say that, an army officer. And in 1956, even writing before the Stalinism, even writing such a thing that trains were coming from Kazakhstan, Siberia, Vorkuta, might be extremely dangerous for the writer, because it was a clear proof that people were just coming back from the gulags. Okay, and what about the liberation again, and the time that were called the Wild West in the literature by many settlers. The Wild West means the western territories of Poland just after the war. There is the description of, as may I read, "I saw two men plundering my own apartment. When I started screaming, although I knew that nobody would hurry to help anyway, one of them said, 'Don't shout, after all, it's not yours, but German.' What should I do? They walked past me and were in no hurry to leave." So there's this a kind of an example of social relation in post-war Poland, especially in the Western territories, when people were expecting that the Third World War will start soon, or at least the Germans will come back sooner or later, so everything is just somehow German, so it belongs to nobody, so looting is just the best strategy. Another description of repressions against Poles just for Polishness or just for being a Pole. As it is written, it was enough to be a member of the Rifle Association, Polish military organization, a son of a Lwów defender from the Polish Bolsheviks war in 1920s. It was enough to be a son of a former policeman. It was enough to be Polish scouting activist, a teacher of Polish history, an officer or a senior of the former Polish army. So there was a variety of reasons just for being a Pole or just for being active in any field of social activism. So you can be threatened. You are threatened with repressions. Another description of acts of cruelty, both against settlers traveling to the West with no exact reason. They were investigated and interrogated, in some cases interrogated in a way that, as written, was equal to death, and as I underlined, even murders of innocent victims, of older people, women or children were committed. So at that time, just traveling, as some people described the migration from the east to the west, even after the end of World War II, was even worse than the German occupation in general. Another example, there were many reports of, I'm not sure how to translate it, the UBI is the political police or the secret police at that time, secret service at that time, and they were trying to collect informations about everything as usual, but they were also trying to find new people to investigate, to provide them information, and this is just one of many examples of repressions, because one of the author of this relation has claimed he denied to participate with the secret police, and he told that my peasant's honor did not allow me to report to the UB. And as a result, he was repressed as a kulak. Kulak means definitely someone rich enough to be repressed for not fitting the communist cliché of nobody. Another example, written by a young woman, 16 years old, and from Kotla. The present name is Kędzierzyn Kotle, I guess. And she and other locals noticed that the commander of militia in that city, that town, was the former executioner of concentration camp. And the more German concentration camp. So nobody knows how, but the former Nazi clerk became a communist and became the commander of militia. The more he murdered 2 other railmen who identified him, the former prisoners of that concentration camp. He managed to kill them, but happily, if I may use this word, he was finally identified and the story is over. So this is just the final slide with both important pictures to me. The right one is the one published a year ago, and it happened someone in Central Russia. The Joseph Stalin's monument was erected, and you can see the members of Russian army marching in front of it. It was just the last year situation. The left one is a bit more complicated. During the opening of Polish cemetery in Katyn, it was in the 2000. There were lots of Poles, of course. There were lots of Russians. And there was just one man, just one, who was distributing these pieces of paper to Poles, and it is written, "Poles, we're terribly sorry." And there was only one who did it. Okay, just to summarize, I'm really honored with the opportunity to stay in front of you, and I'm really grateful for all your interests. I hope to publish a book on these issues next year because it is so shocking, so interesting, and so much unknown that, as I deeply believe, it has to be published as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very harrowing story. Well, I have news for you. The archives are chock full of material like this. Most of it hasn't been mined. I remember even in the case when some things were published in communist Poland as a collection of documents, the editors would take great liberties. For instance, there is a collection, or there was a collection, I don't know where it is, at the Institute of History of Polish Academy of Sciences, and I was able to copy a portion pertinent to a micro-study I was writing about the county of Kraśnik in central Poland, in the Lublin area. It's called My Village Under the Occupation, so it mostly concerns the German occupation, but not only. And it's full of nuggets, uncensored nuggets. Sometimes the submissions, the authors of the submissions would be very careful, and they say, "I hope you don't show it to anybody so I wouldn't get in trouble." This was collected in 1947 or 48 for a competition for a peasant newspaper, and it was from the entire territory of Soviet-occupied Poland, naturally not in the east, but in the center and the west. Fabulous nuggets. When you compare, or when I compared what I found, those weren't originals. Those were already typed up letters, so it behooves a scholar who really wants to delve into it to find the original submissions. Various things that have to do with robberies, that pointed fingers at communist guerrillas. Well, if the communists were not popular in Poland, then they were not. They wanted to eat, they had to rob. So obviously the peasants knew exactly who was robbing them, and rapes galore, including by the Soviets during the war and in the wake of the passing of the Red Army. Hardly any of it has surfaced and been processed in any way. The lacuna in the knowledge, not just popular knowledge, but among scholars, is astonishing. So you ought to be congratulated that you bother to look at what common people have to say. But there are, as I said, there are definitely other depositories, other sources. For instance, so-called county supervisor papers. So every county has an office of the county supervisor. You don't have to go to the provincial town. You can look in the locality into the archives and see things on micro scale. For instance, during the Second World War and in its aftermath, there functioned a charity called Rada Główna Opiekuńcza in central Poland, and it has its offices down to the Gemeinde or village cluster levels. The people who ran those operations tended to be teachers or priests, local landed nobility, intelligentsia, or more prominent farmers. They are chock full of rapes, attacks, and just harrowing experiences handwritten by the local charity workers. I mean, there is what was dubbed as a definite monograph on the Nazi occupation of the Lublin area. And I pointed out 20 years later, after its publication, and it's hailing us, an exhaustive account. I said, look, you guys have hardly anything on the Holocaust, but okay, if you were not interested in that in particular, how about the SS deportation of the Christian population in the summer of 1943? And I was told, but this is not the Zamość area. They deported half the county and nobody noticed. Why? Because the German civilian authorities became upset, and within a month those people were released. It still should not register as a non-event without micro-studies, without delving into the bowels of the smallest of localities and referring to the littlest of the people. You don't know anything. And there you go. The communists had 40 years. They didn't even cover the Nazis. Otherwise, you've all heard about, or most of you, about a little town called Jedwabne, which suddenly became a revelation, which shouldn't have. But nobody really bothered to study anything. Seriously. And I am very glad that now in free Poland, slowly but surely, there is a counter-institutional movement to fill in the gaps, because there was no decommunization. So old communist professors and their new postmodernist clones are in place, and they will bristle at such attempts. I don't know the situation at the University of Poznan, but I know I know enough to understand what it is that post-communist countries are facing. They're facing the establishment, which is lazy and which doesn't like to dirty its hands by conducting micro-studies. The party line is what it is. It first came from Moscow, now it's from Brussels or New York, and that's what they do. Anyway, 2 questions now. Or you're welcome to respond if my analysis is wrong. As I said, I don't.
Yes, it's very interesting. I'm very interested in what you have to say and all the work that went into it. I'm not actually clear on how the diaries, were they solicited? Were the people who wrote them given some guidelines on what they should include? I guess I'm not clear exactly how they were about.
There were officially approved competitions for diaries, for memoirs, and they were sent in a paper version. About 2/3 of them were written in using a writing machine. About 1/3 of it was written by hand, and now it is digitalized and is available.
If I may follow this up with, I guess I'm still trying to understand for the competition, what were they supposed to, what did a good diary or the one that...
Oh, that's a very good question, and I'm afraid that I'm not able to answer it correctly. Well, first of all, there is a variety of motivations why people decided to send their own memories. Some of them, as I am a member of a group of 4 scientists involved in the research, we identified some of the diaries motivated by just the need to say the truth for the first time in 15 years. Some other was, as we believe, motivated by a kind of earning money, because the best diaries selected by the board of professors were to receive money as prizes. Some other we identified as motivated by a kind of psychological, how to say that, catharsis. So I want to write something for the first time in my life. I want to say something I managed to survive, but it was so horrible, as you probably noticed, that some of these relations seem to be extremely shocking, even if the way of just describing such experiences And honestly speaking, these were not the most shocking ones, because if we imagine that some of these were not written but survived by small children, say 10 years old, who had to watch it, it's even more shocking. So, thank you. Yes, please?
Your examples were evenly weighted between experience with the Germans and then later with the Soviets. Does that equate to a balance, a rough balance between experiences with the two, or was one qualitatively more pronounced than the other?
Well, it was the qualitative research, and the list of authors is it's extremely difficult to answer such a question, because in some diaries, say, some of them are 100 pages long or even longer, and people describe at first the war, say military actions in September 1939, then describe the occupation by Germans, and another occupation by Soviets, and another war acts during the front line approaching, and another during the liberation, and another ones during the Stalinism. It is much more complicated than just the 0-1 result, I'm afraid. Yes, please.
In the title of your lecture, it says that civilian survival strategies will be addressed and develop various ways to cope with extreme situations, but I didn't hear that addressed in your lecture. Do you have any comment?
Thank you for this question. I was afraid about such a... well, yes, definitely I should answer the question I posted in the title. Generally speaking, it was much more complicated than just a strategy for survival. There were many examples of kind of heroism when even threatened with restrictions or death. You decided to help others. But what at the present stage of my research, what I was able to identify, that there were very many, dozens, hundreds, perhaps hundreds, examples of small acts of being clever enough to be more clever than an armed German soldier or an armed and drunken Soviet soldier. For instance, the situation with cats. Or another one with dogs. During the Stalinist era, just a short example, in 1950 or so, there's a written example of that everybody has to be counted and described and so on and so forth. So in one village, the communist clerks arrived to count all dogs. So what local farmers did, they just released all dogs and said, okay, now you catch them and count them, so that they were not able to do it. So, and there were many similar examples to be smarter than the enemy, or the smarter than the aggressor, or someone who has the power on one hand, but your only chance to survive, only chance to have something, to have food for your family, was to be smarter. So I'm so sorry, but at the time, right now, I'm not able to answer the question in a satisfying manner, but I hope that, as I told, next year, in a better structured way, there will be a written example of answering your question. Thank you.
We can have one more question. Are there any more questions?
Who will publish?
Who will be the publisher?
Negotiate.
That's a good answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.